President Donald Trump's lawyers are seeking a resolution with the Internal Revenue Service and Treasury Department over a $10 billion lawsuit that the president filed. In that lawsuit, Trump accuses those agencies of leaking his tax information during his first term. The president, along with his sons, Donald Trump Jr. and Eric Trump, filed the lawsuit back in January. In a Friday filing in the Florida District Court, Trump's lawyers asked for a 90-day extension. The president's legal team wants to engage with discussions with those agencies to avoid a drawn-out legal process. Neither the Treasury Department nor IRS have commented on this lawsuit.
Hello and welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Adam is here. So let's get started. Trump sued the IRS and the Treasury Department, agencies he controls, and is now in secret settlement negotiations with those same agencies to write himself a $10 billion check from public funds. He is literally sitting on both sides of the negotiating table. The plaintiff and the defendant are the same person, and the money he's negotiating for is yours.
But we begin this hour with the famous words of our country's 16th president that has long been used to define our democracy. In his 1863 Gettysburg Address, President Abraham Lincoln uttered the words, "Government of the people, by the people, for the people." In other words, our democracy is a government created by, run by, and serving the interests of its citizens. But our latest president has come to define our democracy very differently, where the government appears to be in place to serve his own interests. Take, for example, this week, lawyers for Donald Trump were engaged in talks with the IRS to try and resolve Trump's $10 billion lawsuit over the leak of his tax information during his first term. Trump's lawyers are trying to reach a settlement with Trump's IRS, overseen by Trump's Treasury Secretary, to pay out millions of dollars, if not more, of taxpayer-collected funds into Trump's pocket.
This isn't some wild conspiracy theory floating around the dark corners of the internet. This is documented in an actual federal court filing in the Southern District of Florida. Document number 40 in a case styled Donald Trump, Eric Trump, the Trump Organization, and Don Trump Jr. versus the Internal Revenue Service and the United States Department of Treasury. Just pause and absorb how sick that caption looks sitting on a federal docket. The sitting commander-in-chief suing the very government he leads. The man occupying the White House filing legal claims against agencies that answer to him.
U.S. President Donald Trump is suing the IRS and the Treasury Department for $10 billion as he accuses the federal agencies of a failure to prevent a leak of the president's tax information to news outlets between 2018 and 2020. The suit, filed in a Florida federal court Thursday, includes the president's sons, Eric Trump and Donald Trump Jr., and the Trump Organization as plaintiffs. The filing alleges that the leak of Trump and the Trump Organization's confidential tax records caused reputational and financial harm, public embarrassment, unfairly tarnished their business reputations, portrayed them in a false light, and negatively affected President Trump and the other plaintiffs' public standing. In 2024, former IRS contractor Charles Edward Littlejohn of Washington, D.C., who worked for Booz Allen Hamilton, a defense and national security tech firm, was sentenced to 5 years in prison after pleading guilty to leaking tax information about Trump and others to news outlets.
And now the parties are asking a federal judge for a 90-day pause so they can work out a friendly settlement, which in any normal universe would be recognized as the collusive farce it actually is. Here's how we got to this moment of breathtaking corruption. Back in the early part of this year, Trump filed a lawsuit claiming he was entitled to $10 billion, or possibly more, in damages because of a massive data breach that occurred within the federal government over the last several years.
The IRS and Treasury Department now facing a $10 billion lawsuit from President Trump. The lawsuit filed in Florida accuses the agencies of an unauthorized leak of his tax returns during his first administration. The suit claims the government failed to protect private tax information leaked to the press by Charles Littlejohn, a former IRS contractor. Littlejohn was sentenced to 5 years in prison in 2024. President Trump is filing the suit personally alongside his two eldest sons, not in his official capacity as president.
Tens of thousands of Americans, perhaps far more, had their confidential information exposed by a government employee in what became a significant data breach scandal. Social security numbers, financial records, personal identifying information, all compromised by the very government that's supposed to protect it. And Trump claims his tax information was among the data caught up in that breach. Now let's be clear about something right up front. If Trump's information was genuinely exposed in a data breach, he might have a legitimate grievance, just like any other American citizen whose private data was mishandled by the government. But here's where the absurdity rockets into the stratosphere. Trump isn't claiming reasonable damages like any normal litigant. He's demanding $10 billion. $10 billion. A number so astronomical, so divorced from any rational calculation of harm, that it reveals the entire exercise for what it really is: a shakedown of the American taxpayer by the man currently occupying the Oval Office. And by the way, if Trump's logic holds that a data breach entitles someone to $10 billion, then every single American whose information was compromised should theoretically receive the same amount. We'd be talking about a payout that would exceed the entire GDP of most nations on Earth. But there's an even deeper layer of hypocrisy underneath all of this. For decades, every president of the United States, going back through modern history, voluntarily released their tax returns to the American public. It wasn't legally required, no statute mandated it, but it was understood as a fundamental threshold of transparency. The American people deserved to know whether their president had financial entanglements that could compromise their judgment. They needed to see whether there were conflicts of interest, hidden investments, foreign connections, or emoluments violations lurking in the tax filings. This tradition existed because we all understood that the most powerful person on earth shouldn't have secret financial dealings. From Nixon forward, every president and every major presidential candidate made their returns public. It was simply what honorable people did. Donald Trump shattered that tradition completely. He fought tooth and nail to keep his tax returns hidden during his first term. When Democrats gained control of the House and used their subpoena power to finally obtain them, the case went all the way to the Supreme Court. And when those returns finally saw daylight, they revealed exactly what critics had suspected. Trump paid virtually nothing in federal income taxes. Many years it was $0. Other years it was a paltry $750. Not a lower percentage than working Americans, actually less in raw dollars than what teachers and truck drivers and farmers pay into the system that funds our military, our infrastructure, and our social safety net. Dollar for dollar, the supposedly billionaire president was contributing less to the national treasury than the people serving coffee and building houses and educating children. So that's the backdrop against which this current shakedown is unfolding. A man who fought desperately to hide his tax returns, who paid essentially nothing into the system, is now seeking to extract $10 billion from that same system. And he's in active settlement negotiations with agencies whose leadership answers directly to him. The court document that exposes all of this is styled as a simple motion for extension of time. It sounds boring, it sounds procedural, but the content is explosive. The plaintiffs, Donald Trump and his family members and business entities, respectfully move the court with the consent of the defendants, the IRS, and the Department of Treasury for a 90-day extension of all proceedings in this matter. Let that phrase sink in. With the consent of the defendants. The defendants are the IRS and the Treasury Department. Those agencies are run by people Trump appointed, people who serve at his pleasure, people who can be fired with a single tweet if they displease the boss. Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, is the man you see on television gushing about how brilliant Donald Trump is. That's who's supposedly representing the government's interests in negotiating against Donald Trump. And what are they asking for specifically? They want 90 days to engage in settlement discussions. 90 days for the parties to work out an agreement that resolves this case without trial, without discovery, without any adversarial process where the American public might see what's actually happening. The motion states that the parties are engaging in discussions and need time to ensure those discussions can take place productively. It claims the extension will promote judicial economy and allow the parties to explore avenues that could narrow or resolve the issues efficiently. It asserts that this brief pause will allow the parties to initiate and structure discussions in a manner that best serves everyone's interests. But here's what's actually happening beneath those sanitized legal phrases. In a normal lawsuit, when the parties request time for settlement discussions, there are genuine adversaries on both sides. The plaintiff wants as much money as possible. The defendant wants to pay as little as possible. Government lawyers are supposed to be stewards of the public fisc, fiercely protecting taxpayer dollars from excessive claims. They're supposed to evaluate exposure soberly, push back hard, and only settle when it genuinely serves the public interest. That's how the Department of Justice handled cases in previous administrations. They fought. They defended the Treasury. They treated taxpayer money as something sacred to be protected. What's happening in this case is the polar opposite. There are no adversaries in this lawsuit. There's just Donald Trump on one side and Donald Trump's subordinates on the other side, masquerading as opponents while they collaborate on how much money to transfer from the public treasury to the president's pocket. Can you picture how these settlement discussions work behind closed doors? Trump's personal lawyers sit on one side of the table. The government lawyers, who report to Trump appointees who report to Trump, sit on the other side. And the conversation goes something like, "What do you want, boss? I want $10 billion. Is that enough, boss? Should we make it 15? We don't want you to fire us." That's not how the system is supposed to work. That's not how any previous administration operated. Obama couldn't have sued the government and then settled with himself. Biden couldn't have done this. Any other president attempting this would face immediate impeachment and likely criminal prosecution for the most egregious abuse of power imaginable. But this is the Trump administration, where job number 1 through 10 is serving Donald Trump's personal interests, and everything else is a distant afterthought. And look at who's on the other side of this collusive arrangement. The lawsuit is styled as Trump versus the IRS and Treasury. In any legitimate legal dispute, those agencies would be zealously defending the public interest. They'd be filing motions to dismiss. They'd be challenging the astronomical damages claim. They'd be demanding proof of actual harm. Instead, they're consenting to a 90-day pause so they can figure out how much money to fork over. The IRS, which is supposed to be the agency that ensures everyone pays their fair share, is in settlement talks with a man who paid almost nothing in taxes while trying to extract billions from the very system he refuses to support. Consider the deeper implications of what Trump plans to do with this money. When confronted about the obvious corruption of settling with himself for $10 billion, Trump offered a defense. He claims he's not going to keep the money personally. He says he's going to donate it. Sounds noble, right? Except anyone with even basic knowledge of tax law can see the grift immediately. If you take $10 billion from the government and then donate that money to a charitable entity, you get to deduct that donation from your taxes. So Trump takes taxpayer money, routes it through himself to a charitable organization, probably something he controls, like his presidential library, and then uses the deduction to offset any tax liability he might ever have again in perpetuity. He never pays taxes again, ever. The American taxpayer funds his charitable giving, and he pockets the tax benefit forever. The charitable entity he'd likely route this through deserves scrutiny as well. Trump has a long history of using charitable organizations as personal piggy banks. His presidential library would almost certainly be a Trump-branded property that generates revenue for the Trump organization. So the $10 billion in taxpayer money doesn't just disappear into charity. It gets funneled into a building that Trump owns, that charges fees, that generates profit, that builds the Trump brand, all while providing a massive tax shield that ensures he never contributes another dime to the treasury that funds the military, builds highways, supports schools, and protects national parks. The judge handling this case makes the situation even more interesting and potentially more dangerous for Trump's scheme. Judge Kathleen Mary Williams sits on the district court in the Southern District of Florida, Miami Division. She was appointed by President Barack Obama back in July of 2010. She's developed a reputation as a no-nonsense jurist who isn't afraid to make tough rulings when the law demands it. She presided over cases involving the Everglades Detention Center and its impact on indigenous communities. She has a track record of standing up to government overreach. She's not the kind of judge who rubber stamps collusive settlements just because the parties are smiling and agreeing. For there to be a legitimate case in federal court, there needs to be something called Article 3 standing, an actual case or controversy between genuinely adverse parties. The Constitution doesn't give federal courts the power to issue advisory opinions or bless friendly arrangements between buddies. Courts exist to resolve real disputes between people who actually disagree. What Trump and his government are asking Judge Williams to do is preside over a charade. They want her courtroom to serve as the venue for what amounts to a staged transaction where Trump's subordinates hand him billions in taxpayer money and call it a settlement. Jamie Raskin and other Democratic members of Congress have already signaled that if they regain control in the upcoming midterm elections, this settlement arrangement will be a central focus of aggressive oversight investigations. They'll demand every communication, every email, every meeting note, every discussion that took place during these secret settlement talks. They'll want to know exactly who authorized the government to concede rather than fight. They'll want to know what threats were made to ensure cooperation. They'll want to know who came up with the $10 billion figure and how that number was calculated. Because if this settlement goes through before oversight can intervene, the American public may never learn the full extent of what happened behind those closed doors. The secrecy is the most dangerous element of all. Settlement agreements can sometimes be filed under seal, hidden from public view. In a normal case, judges approve sealed settlements when both parties agree and there's a legitimate reason for confidentiality, like protecting trade secrets or national security information. But here, the only thing being protected is the public's right to know how their money is being stolen. Trump and his team could try to finalize this settlement in darkness, with no public disclosure, no accountability, no paper trail visible to the voters who funded this $10 billion heist. Then, when Democrats or journalists come asking questions, the response will be, "That's a confidential settlement. We can't discuss it." This pattern of collusive lawsuits isn't new for the Trump orbit. We've seen it before with Michael Flynn and Steve Bannon. In those cases, the administration essentially jumped over to the same side as the defendant, making a mockery of the adversarial process. Flynn, after receiving what many considered an unjust pardon, brought a lawsuit claiming malicious prosecution. The problem was, to win such a lawsuit, you typically need to show you were actually innocent. Flynn had pleaded guilty twice. He admitted under oath to the crimes he later claimed were fabricated. But because the administration was now aligned with Flynn rather than opposed to him, the government simply stopped fighting. When it's the administration versus a friend of the administration, they just hop over to the same side of the V in the case caption, declare the dispute resolved, and hand over money with a smile. The same thing happened with Bannon. And now it's happening with Trump himself, except this time the stakes are $10 billion instead of a few million. And this time the plaintiff is the actual sitting president. The entire thing is a carnival game, a rigged outcome masquerading as legitimate legal process. They file a piece of paper creating the appearance of a dispute. Then they go behind closed doors. One friend says to another, "How'd you like to help yourself to a wheelbarrow full of cash from the Treasury?" And they emerge announcing a settlement that no genuine adversary would ever have agreed to. Now consider the broader context of what Trump's administration has been doing with Americans' private information. While Trump sues over his own data allegedly being exposed, his administration has been aggressively collecting and exposing the private information of millions of Americans in service of its immigration enforcement agenda. Social security data, tax information, voting records, all being gathered and shared in ways that raise serious privacy concerns. So on one hand, Trump demands $10 billion because his information might have been exposed. On the other hand, his administration is exposing the information of ordinary Americans on a massive scale. The hypocrisy would be staggering if the corruption weren't even more staggering. And remember the emoluments clause. Remember that the Constitution explicitly prohibits the president from receiving payments or benefits from the federal government beyond his salary. The framers put that clause in the Constitution specifically to prevent the kind of self-dealing we're watching unfold right now. They understood that a president might be tempted to use the office for personal enrichment. They created a constitutional barrier against exactly this scenario. Yet here we are with Trump's team preparing to transfer $10 billion from the Treasury to the president, and much of the country has become so numb to the constant chaos that it barely registers as news. The irony cuts even deeper when you consider that this administration has been singularly focused on cutting spending that benefits ordinary Americans. Healthcare programs face the axe. Rental assistance gets slashed. Food assistance for struggling families gets reduced. Education funding gets gutted. Infrastructure projects get canceled, all in the name of fiscal responsibility. Government agencies that protect consumers, that safeguard the environment, that enforce workplace safety, dismantled piece by piece. But somehow, mysteriously, there's $10 billion available to settle a collusive lawsuit with the president. The math never works for regular people. It only works for Trump. The international dimension is staggering too. Leaders like Putin and Orban have been accused of using state power to enrich themselves and their cronies, but even they tend to be subtler about it. They don't file public court documents memorializing the scheme. They don't have their subordinates sign motions consenting to the transfer of state funds into private accounts. The sheer brazenness of this arrangement, the complete disregard for even the appearance of propriety, is unprecedented in any modern democracy. It's the kind of thing that would seem too over the top if you put it in a satirical movie. When the movie Idiocracy portrayed a dystopian future run by corrupt fools, even that film didn't imagine a president suing himself and settling for billions. So, what comes next? The motion for a 90-day extension sits on Judge Williams' desk. She can grant it or deny it. She can demand more information about the nature of these settlement discussions. She can ask pointed questions about whether this is a genuine dispute or a collusive arrangement designed to raid the federal treasury. If she grants the extension, Trump and his government team have 3 months to work out the details of the settlement behind closed doors, away from public scrutiny. If she denies it, the case has to move forward with discovery and motions, and the adversarial process that might expose the corruption to daylight. Come the midterm elections, if control of Congress changes hands, this settlement, these discussions, every communication between Trump's lawyers and Trump's government will become Exhibit A in oversight hearings. Subpoenas will fly. Testimony will be demanded. The full scope of this attempt to funnel $10 billion taxpayer dollars into Trump's pocket will be laid bare for the American people to see. And then the question becomes whether even a population that's been battered into numbness by years of scandal can still recognize corruption this blatant and demand accountability. Because here's the thing that should break through even the thickest walls of exhaustion and cynicism. This isn't complicated. You don't need a law degree to understand why it's wrong for a president to sue the government he runs and then settle with himself for $10 billion. You don't need to follow politics closely to grasp that the person sitting on both sides of a negotiation isn't really negotiating. This cuts through the noise. A president paying himself billions from the Treasury while claiming he'll donate it for the tax deduction, while your healthcare gets more expensive and your rent keeps climbing and the services your family depends on keep getting cut. That's the reality of this moment. That's what's hiding in Document 40 in a Florida federal court.